Welcome, dear listeners, to this episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. Well, wow, I find myself in a place I've been really keen to visit for, well, in fact, the whole of my adult life. I'm here on the Isle of Wight and it's my first visit here. And I've been lucky enough to arrive on an incredibly beautiful sunny summer's day at the top of a place called Bembridge Down. And we'll be talking in a moment with our expert and guide today about why we've met right here. Now, in fact, the topic of the day is all about the Mary Rose and the Battle of the Solent. Now, of course, I have covered this topic before, particularly when I met with our current guest a few episodes ago now at Cowdray House. We were talking about the Cowdray murals. And so I think this is a great time to say hello, Dominic Fontana. Welcome back to the Tudor History and Travel Show.
Well, I'm glad to be back, Sarah, and it's lovely to see you here on such a fabulous day with the skylarks flying.
They are indeed. And I'm actually here because of you, because when we met and recorded our podcast before, you said, oh, because you're an inhabitant here, you're an island dweller, aren't you?
I am.
And so you said, come on over to the Isle of Wight, Sarah, and we can stand at some specific spots which help us tell the story of the Battle of the Solent and actually see it geographically. Well, that was something I just couldn't turn away. So thank you for inviting us.
Well, thank you for coming. It gives me the opportunity to show you the sheer scale of the operation that the French had put into place to try and invade England.
Absolutely. And this episode is actually going out on the anniversary of the sinking of the Mary Rose, which was?
The 19th of July, 1545.
Okay, so we're going to transport ourselves back in time. And we're here on the Isle of Wight because it has some real associations with the French attack. And you're going to tell us all about that and how the French actually invaded the island in a moment. But for those people who perhaps don't know so much about this Battle of the Solent and how it came to happen in the first instance, I think before we kind of talk about where we are, we should roll things back a little bit and put some context in place. So, what was going on in Europe at the time that led the French to think that this was a great time to try and invade England?
Gosh, that's a big question. So much was going on in Europe, just over the English Channel, not very far from where we're standing. There was great rivalry in the years leading up to the Battle of the Solent in 1545 between Francois I, King of France, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain. And with Henry VIII as the other party in those discussions, shall we say, they kept making alliances with one another. And so there was a shift of power going on all the time over that period. And at the point where the French decided to invade England, Francois was very much the opponent of Henry VIII. Henry had really upset Francois, largely by invading France in 1544. In the summer of 1544, Henry took an army of about 40,000 English soldiers across the Channel from Dover over to Calais, which was an English possession at the time. And then they'd marched, originally intending to march on Paris, but deciding to divert to Boulogne, where Henry laid siege to the town of Boulogne, shot an awful lot of artillery at the town and the townspeople, did a lot of damage, and captured the town in September of 1544. It was very much a case of Henry wanting to prove that he was still a warrior prince. I mean, this stage he was getting towards the end of his life. He was not a well man, and I think rather fooling himself that he was still young and energetic and able to actually carry on campaign. But that's what he did. And he'd acquired lots of money from the dissolution of the monasteries that enabled him to afford to do this. And so Henry was really pushing hard at Francois, and Francois really felt the ignominy of having his town of Boulogne taken from him. It really, really upset him. And consequently, he must have spent several months thinking about that and arranging for support from other parts of Europe, and in particular from the Pope, and gathering together an enormous force. He managed to bring over to Le Havre, on the north coast of France, an army of about 30,000 soldiers and about 225 ships within which to convey them across the English Channel to invade England and depose Henry VIII himself.
Do we know what the scale of the sort of goal was for Francis? I mean, when you stop and think about what he was trying to do, it's a little bit mind-boggling. Was there a plan in place?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think he had a plan in the sense that he wanted to topple Henry. I'm not so sure that they'd really thought through the military tactics that would be necessary in order to bring that actually to fruition. Because we ended up with a situation of this massive French fleet with a huge army aboard, ending up just off the eastern end of the Isle of Wight, with no means of getting those soldiers ashore except by the ship's boats. That means that you could land maybe 20 troops at a time from a boat. Now, onto an opposed shore, they really aren't going to stand much of a chance.
It's like the Tudor version of the D-Day landings.
It is exactly that. It's this problem of how do you shift very large amounts of men and material, their equipment, their food, their armaments, their powder. How do you get that all ashore and mustered up so that it's in useful quantities? And that's a really tricky thing in Tudor naval operations.
And do you think there was just ignorance of the geography?
No, I don't. I actually think that the French knew the coast pretty well. It's only just, 80 miles across to the north coast of France directly from the Isle of Wight. There would have been trading links. There would have been sailors going backwards and forwards from both sides. The English certainly knew the French coast. The French almost certainly knew the English coast extremely well. And, it is this thing. How do you manage all those people? You've got no mobile telephones. You've got no computers to communicate with your men in the field. You've got to do it all by letters and messages. You've got to try and get together enormous amounts of food simply to keep the army going.
Yeah.
And, if that's got to be some meat and some bread, that's thousands of loaves of bread that you're going to need every single day.
And where did all the ships come from? They set sail from Le Havre, didn't they, which is on the French coast. But where did all of these boats come from?
The French had quite a lot of ships around on the north coast. So that's most of the big sailing ships that they brought. Those mostly acted as troop transports and as the battleships. But they'd also arranged to bring galleys from the Mediterranean. And the galleys were very different from the northern European ships. They relied not so much on wind. They did have a sail, big sail, but they were able to use oars to manoeuvre. They were filled with galley slaves who were prisoners of war and convicts, whose job it was really solely to be the motive power of those vessels. And by God, they could row.
Wow.
So they were brought from Venice and from Genoa. They'd sailed all the way down the coast of Italy, joined up, gone from there right the way across the Mediterranean, out through the Straits of Gibraltar, and then up the coast of Portugal. And we know that they called in at Lisbon on their way up past Portugal because they picked up a pilot to navigate them up to Le Havre, who turns out to be a Dominican friar, in other words, a monk, a chap called Ferdinand Oliveira, who brought them all the way across the Bay of Biscay and up the western approaches into the Channel and up to Le Havre. So they'd amassed lots of ships, probably about 225 of them at Le Havre, filled them up with 30,000 soldiers and just about every conceivable item of artillery and powder and shot. The king, Francois, had then had dinner on board his flagship with his admiral, Claude d'Annebot. And just after dinner, the flagship, caught alight and was burnt down to the waterline.
Oh, you're kidding. I didn't know
Quite
that.
a number of people killed. So that was a very bad omen.
They would have seen it like that.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Very much so. And so they transferred, actually. Then the admiral transferred over to another ship. And they started to think about heading across the Channel. And so they came out of Le Havre. And the newly appointed flagship promptly hit the bottom. It ran aground, displaced its masts, and started shipping water. Now, it's not quite clear from the documents as to whether she made it right the way over here or not. She may have done. But then they had to transfer again from that vessel to a third vessel as the flagship. So nothing has gone right. And they haven't even reached the Isle of Wight.
Crikey.
Yeah. So when they arrived, the Admiral Claude d'Annebot was on his third flagship. The fleet was with him. There are 30,000 soldiers in amongst the crew of all of these big sailing ships. And let's think a bit about that for a minute too.
Please do paint us a picture of what life on board would have been like.
Well, life on board for the sailors was hard, but it was what they were used to. Life on board for the soldiers would have been totally different to their normal experience. For one thing, they'd be reliant upon the crew of the ship to provide them with their food, which wouldn't be what they normally eat out in the field. They normally make a campfire and cook their own food on the campfire. So, barbecued meat and some bread and things like that.
And wine.
And wine, yes, absolutely. And then they'd be on board a ship where they would be being fed largely things like boiled meat or boiled vegetables and so on. They probably wouldn't have liked that much. No. And then you've got the delicate problem of how do you go to the lavatory?
Was it over the side of the ship?
It was over the side of the ship, but up at the heads, at the bow of the ship.
Right.
And dangling over the side. Now,
quite dangerous, really.
Absolutely. Not only dangerous, but completely different from their normal field practice as a soldier of sort of wandering off and digging a hole.
Yeah.
So, you've got things like that. And it's such a strange, for them, high-tech environment as to, being able to manage their own lives. And to be confined to that ship for a few days while you make your crossing across the English Channel, knowing that you're about to face an enemy, my goodness.
The tension on board.
It must have been absolutely palpable.
Yeah, and frustrating as well when they got here. We'll talk about that in a moment, what happened when they got here. But can I just go back to the point that we made about the plan that didn't seem to be in place? I guess I'm thinking the only plan they must have had was that somehow they were going to sink the English fleet in Portsmouth Harbour and get access to the harbour. That must have been it, right?
I think that's pretty much what they were trying to do. They thought that the English would sail out from Portsmouth Harbour and the Solent out into the English Channel, where they would have a ship-on-ship artillery contest and the French would win because they outnumbered the English about 3-1. Now, the English would have been very silly to have taken up that challenge.
Be lured out.
Be lured out. The thing is that nobody had really done this at that stage. They'd never really tried an artillery battle between broadside firing ships. And so everybody was learning. Everybody was learning about the ships, about the weapon systems, about the tactics that you might employ. So
there'd never been a battle at sea.
Not of that sort or of that scale.
Really? You see, I hadn't appreciated that either.
You know, it was a steep learning curve, I think, for everybody. And you're trying to do this where your ability to adapt to changing circumstances is quite limited because of the communications difficulties.
Yeah.
You know, you can't make instant decisions. You really have to plan what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And you're doing it within what can be a very dynamic environment with changing tides and changing currents, changing wind, and so on. And so, you know, it's very difficult to see how you would do it. The French made a big mistake because they hadn't really thought the whole process through sufficiently. And it was this problem of landing the troops. What they were hoping to do, I think, is to make it into Portsmouth Harbour, where there were some deep water quaysides, because there they could pull the ships up and just discharge all the troops. Or Southampton, where equally there are some large deep water quaysides, and again they could have discharged troops. But blocking the middle of the Solent was Henry VIII's fleet. They weren't going anywhere. They were just sitting there on their anchor cables, spread across the Solent and Spithead, such that the French couldn't go past them without being shot up. So we have a sort of slightly stalemate situation.
A stand-up. We have a Mexican standoff.
Absolutely. Both sides armed to the teeth, both ready to let loose on the other, but unable to do so. Also, and I think this is also quite crucial to the whole event, was that the weather was just like today.
Was it now?
And
I was going to ask about the weather.
You know, we can feel it here. We've got no wind.
Yeah.
And we're right on top of a hill here.
Yeah.
And so the big English ships and the big French ships couldn't move. The galleys, on the other hand, that the French had brought from the Mediterranean could.
Because they had the oarsmen.
Because they had the oarsmen. And so what then happened is that the French admirals sent some of the galleys in to attack the vanguard of the English ships over there in the middle of the Solent, looking over towards Portsmouth. You know, it's a narrow strip of water.
I think at this point we maybe should do a little bit of geography for those people who really don't know so much about the Isle of Wight and its relationship to the south coast and Portsmouth. So could we, before we get into the battle a little bit more, maybe we could just therefore pause and just describe where we are in the world and literally where we're standing. And I should say, actually, dear listeners, that we are actually videoing this particular podcast. So I hope that there will be a video that you might be able to tune into to see a little bit of the surroundings that we're talking about. And failing that, there certainly will be a show notes page, and we'll be taking some pictures as we move around the island so that you can see some of the landmarks that Dominic and I are talking about. Anyway, back to you, Dominic. Where are we in the world and where are we standing?
Well, we're here on the Isle of Wight, which is an island about 10 miles from north to south and about 20 miles from east to west. And we're just off the south coast of England, right in the central south coast. Just over to the north of us is the city of Portsmouth.
And literally we can see that from where we're standing.
From where we're standing. And in between the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth is the Solent. It's a narrow piece of sea, it's tidal. It has very strong currents that run in it, so a mariner has to be aware of what they're doing. And although it's a relatively open stretch of water, it has constraining sandbanks on both the island side and the mainland side that make it much more difficult to navigate. So a sailor really has to know what they're doing when they come into the Solent. And getting into Portsmouth Harbour, very, very tricky indeed.
Is it? Yeah.
So the island is just here off the south coast, and we can see probably about 15 miles, 20 miles into the distance up to the South Downs.
Absolutely. So we can easily see, yes, it's in the distance, but we can easily see the south coast of England stretching across in front of us, and a couple of landmarks in Portsmouth. The famous Spinnaker Tower is quite evident from here, which is very close to where you get the ferry to come over to the Isle of Wight, if anybody's listening and wants to follow it in our footsteps after this podcast. And of course we've got the expanse of this particular part of the Isle of Wight in front of us.
Yeah, and this particular hill is the eastern end of the chalk ridge that runs right the way across the middle of the island from east to west. Ends up in the famous Needles at the western end of the island. And from here, this particular part of the island could be cut off by water coming into Bembridge Harbour and around through to the back of us over to Sandown Bay.
Right.
And that was very much the case in Tudor times.
All right, okay.
So almost a sub-island
within
of
an
the
island.
Isle of Wight.
Okay.
Yes.
And so we're looking at, we've got the expanse of the water here, and it is just here, I know because you were telling me before we started this recording, that the French fleet basically pulled up. Can you describe what we'd be seeing here if we were standing here on that day in 1545?
Yeah, I mean, over to Portsmouth at the north, and then if we look round over to the east, right the way around on the horizon, we can see ships there today waiting to go into Southampton water. That would have all been filled with these French ships, the whole French fleet, right the way round to the eastern view, right the way round past the eastern end of the island, out into Sandown Bay behind us. It must have been a phenomenal sight.
It must have. And I could just imagine if you were an islander standing here watching the ships coming closer on the horizon and seeing this just fleet coming towards you, it must have been pretty terrifying.
Absolutely, because their intent was known.
Yeah.
They knew that they were intending to land and invade. And you think, the normal population of the island at that time was maybe about 6,000.
Right.
And that includes all the old people, all the children, all the women, and so on. And my goodness, they'd be facing potentially 30,000 soldiers. Yeah. It would have been a state of utter alarm.
There were some English soldiers that Henry had sent over here.
Henry actually was in a really difficult position because his main army was still in France, where he'd invaded and captured Boleyn in 1544. Right. So all he really had in England were farmhands and militia.
Ooh.
And he'd sent groups of the Hampshire militia and the Wiltshire militia over to join the Isle of Wight militia to defend the island. And as far as I can tell at the moment, they had probably about 2,500 men here on the island in order to try and repel the French attacks.
It sounds a bit like Dad's army of the Tudor period. Now, if you're overseas, you may not know what Dad's army is like. Am I being really unfair?
No, you're not. I think that's actually a pretty fair summation of the situation. It really was getting a bit desperate. Henry, certainly in his letters at the time, kept writing down to the ports in the West Country, to Exeter and to Falmouth, to try and get the West Country to send more ships and send more men. And they couldn't do it because they didn't have enough men and they didn't have enough victuals to supply them with food and so on the way. And he was trying to raise mercenary troops from Europe to come over and help. He had a big order in for German mercenary troops with his agent in Antwerp. He'd paid lots of money,
I didn't
and
realise
no
any
German
of this.
troops had turned up.
Oh, really? That would have put him in a good mood.
I suspect not. He wasn't exactly a jolly
No, he wasn't.
thing. So things were not going well at all for Henry and the English. And for the island itself, they were preparing and had been preparing for invasion for quite some time. The abbey at Quor had been dissolved in the dissolution of the monasteries. The stone from the church there had been stripped down by a Southampton merchant and used to build fortifications on the north coast of the Isle of Wight, both at West Cowes and at East Cowes, and probably further fortifications amongst the remains of the abbey at Quor, as well as building a fort at Seaview, which played a part in the battle, shooting into the sides of the French galleys. And they'd just recently built a new fort down at Sandown Bay. So the English and the islanders knew this was coming for quite some time. Huge efforts and huge amounts of money had been expended to bring this all together. But when it's put to the test, when that big fleet turns up off the Isle of Wight, just on that eastern horizon that we're looking at, and you think, my goodness, how are we going to stop that?
How are we going to do this? And we've got, of course, Henry over on the south coast at Southsea Castle with, I guess, his Privy Council there. He can see this as well. He can see everything going on.
And in fact, that's one of the crucial things that the French were hoping would make a difference. That if they landed on the Isle of Wight and burnt some of the villages, that would so enrage Henry that he would send his ships to their assistance.
And lure them out
of
the harbour.
And luckily enough, Henry and his admiral, John Dudley, Lord Lisle, didn't fall into that trap. They remained stationary in the Solent.
And what has been tempting, because from where Henry was standing, and maybe we're jumping forward a bit because I do want us to talk about the actual invasion and what happened, but let's just clear this point up. From where Henry was standing, if they were burning things, he would have seen the smoke coming up, he would have seen all of that carnage unfolding on his land.
Oh yes, he would. And I'm sure he would not have been happy about that situation. Just the indignity of his land being attacked by the French would have been quite something.
Yeah.
But, he was quite rational in the sense that he understood what was going on. The next thing that the French then tried doing as well was to attack the English ships by using the galleys. And the galleys, because they could row and make their way without wind, were able to run into the Solent, and they were able to group up just off the coast of the Isle of Wight at a piece of sea that is now known as No Man's Land.
Okay.
And that was halfway between the French fleet and the English fleet.
Right.
But it's a sandbank, and it's usually quite shallow water over it. But the galleys, because they didn't pull much depth of water beneath them, could go there and sit there, organise themselves, get armed, and then do a run-in directly to the bows of the English ships, loose off their forward-facing guns at the English, who couldn't fire back at them because the English ships could fire broadside. They could go to the port side, the left, or the right side, the starboard side, but not very much directly ahead.
Wow. I mean, that leaves a very vulnerable So yeah, that you would think that might have tempted them out to start putting to sail and to turn the ships around to start firing. What happened?
Well, the French had an opportunity between about 7 o'clock in the morning of Sunday the 19th of July 1545 and about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in which their galleys would be favoured by the tidal current, pushing them directly towards the bows of the English ships and ensuring that the English ships were facing bow on towards the French galleys. Perfect to get into, maybe 300-400 metres from the bows of the English ships, loose off the big forward-facing guns on the galleys, do some damage to the vanguard of the English ships, which was the Mary Rose and the Great Harry. And the French certainly report that they hit the ships.
Oh, did they? Did they?
The Great Harry was said to have been hit so much that it was difficult to keep it afloat.
Really?
That's the French claim. The English make no statement at all on that. But we do know that the Mary Rose sank.
Of course we do, and we'll definitely come on to that in a moment. But in the meantime, I think we should cover the landing of the troops on the Isle of Wight before we really get stuck into the heat of battle and what unfolded with the Mary Rose. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there were several landings made on the island, all on this eastern side of the island. The first one, which was officially sanctioned, was at Seaview, which is up towards Portsmouth as we look across, where the galleys had been getting upset by the flanking fire coming in from the small fort. It was officially sanctioned by the Admiral, so this was orders, and he sent a party ashore just to the south of Seaview, where the French soldiers made their way up to the fort, chased away the defending soldiers in the fort, who tried to make their way back to the south into some woods, where the French say that they caught them and killed them.
Right.
Now, it wasn't a very big fort, and it probably only had a couple of guns in it, but it was enough to be a real nuisance. So that was one small, probably quite brutal action. The next action was further to the south of us, where a group came ashore, again, trying to make their way inland to see what happened. They got chased off by the Isle of Wight militia, so didn't manage to make it terribly far. And then we come to the spot where we are now, and from here we can see, looking over towards the village of Bembridge and St Helens, and Bembridge Harbour, and there's a sand spit that just comes out into the sea. And that was the point where some of the French soldiers, some of the commanders on some of the galleys, decided to take action for themselves without official orders.
Was that a serious breach?
Probably.
Do you think they would have been punished for that, or?
They would have been, perhaps, if the French side had won, maybe. In the event, the soldiers landed and they started to manoeuvre around through Bembridge over here and then up towards where we're standing on top of the downs here.
Yes, which is a really elevated position, and people will see that from the images or the video if they tune in to watch the video. So you mentioned that spit of sand, which we can easily see from here, but I know there's an opportunity perhaps to go down and stand there and be perhaps in the footsteps of those French soldiers as they came abroad.
There's nothing like being on the ground to really understand it.
I think you're absolutely right. So that's where we're going to head next. Let's go there.
Splendid.
Okay, great, Dominic. Well, you've brought us down to the beach by Bembridge itself, which is where the French troops came ashore.
It's right on this spot here.
Is it really?
They would have come from just offshore, the whole horizon full of ships, and just made their way through this very, very shallow water here and up onto this gorgeous beach.
It's lovely, isn't it? Must have been very easy to bring the rowing boats aboard and...
Very easy, very peaceful.
Yeah.
Apart from landing on a hostile shore.
Yeah, yeah.
And just down to the south of us, we've got Bembridge ledges. So that creates big limestone pavements that go out under the water. And you could not bring a boat ashore there. You have to be here.
So it's really
right on this spot.
That is so exciting. And they would have come ashore. I mean, I've got a very, very vivid imagination, so I can easily see the whole skyline there filled with ships. Really dramatic and exciting. And of course, they would have just standing as we are on the shore now, can still see Portsmouth. Just over the way there, we can almost wave at Henry. Hello, Henry. He's not that far away,
over
is
in
he?
Southsea Castle, yeah. And the whole of the English fleet just sitting over there.
Wow.
We could see it all from this spot.
Very dramatic. I wonder what it was like just for your casual eyewitness, just seeing this unfold.
Terrifying, I imagine.
Terrifying. Which way is this going to go? Oh, my goodness me. So, what else can we see here? Because you get a completely different perspective. Before we were way up high, we could see for miles. You could see all the way, almost, different angles around the island. Here you've got a much narrower field of vision, but what could we see? What are the other landmarks?
Well, we can see the entrance to Bembridge Harbour here, which is a very narrow, very shallow entrance. In Tudor days, it would have gone right the way through to Sandown. There would also have been a spit running out on the other side there, out to where the Victorian sea fort is, part of Lord Palmerston's defences of Portsmouth. So it would have been quite a constrained area. And that actually is also pretty crucial, because the landings that were made here were made firstly without orders.
Right.
And you can just see how those soldiers out on the boats would think, well, it's not very far over there.
Nice beach.
Nice beach, place to land. You can make your way inland from here. And they would have been so tempted. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Just over the other side of the entrance to the harbour, we've got St Helen's Church, which appears just as a white square, which is a sea mark so that mariners can line up on it.
Ah, I see.
The church itself was largely washed away in the early 18th century, so now only half of the tower still survives on the other side of that white brick wall. So it now performs a navigation function rather than a religious function.
But that was, I think you were telling me that's actually visible on the Cowdray mural.
Yes, it is, that's right. And just off there in the sandbanks, about 10, 12 years ago, there was a large lead pot found, which looks rather as though it might have been a font liner from the church at St Helens.
Oh, right.
If so, that might well have been stolen by the French attacking the church and saying, oh, that's a nice piece of lead, I'll have that and take that with me, and then losing it on the way.
Yeah.
So it's amazing what does turn up.
Yeah. And anything else that we could see or need to pay attention to on the skyline here? And you were talking about the galley before that the English...
Yes, well, that's right. Yes, the English, because they sank a galley, it should be just off here, directly over there, somewhere maybe a few 100 metres out to sea.
Tantalising.
Very tantalising.
And I hear you're looking for it.
Well, I have been looking for it. I haven't found it yet. It may be there somewhere. Who knows? If we did find it, wouldn't that be wonderful? Not just to have the Mary Rose herself, but one of her opponents as well.
That would be superb. What kind of scale would that boat be in comparison to the Mary Rose,
She would have been
for example?
smaller than the Mary Rose because she was one of the Mediterranean galleys. She probably would have been about 40 metres long.
Okay.
There may not be that much of it left because she wouldn't have sunk terribly far out, and the seabed is sandy. So she'd probably be buried down in the sand.
Okay.
But it would be lovely if we managed to find her at some point.
Oh, that would be amazing. Are you going to keep your quest going?
As I can, yes. Who knows?
Yes, expensive undertaking, I would
Indeed.
imagine. Wonderful. Okay, brilliant. I think we need to continue our story back up on the fort. So let's go back to where we were before. Let's go.
Let's do. Yep.
We are really high up here.
And that is why they'd have wanted to get up here, because then they can look across to the open areas of the rest of the Isle of Wight. And, you know, if you're a young soldier who wants to get going, is looking for a bit of looting and profit and so on, they would have been really tempted to do that, especially if there didn't appear to be much opposition to them at this point.
Yes, and they'd been cooped up on the ship, as we were saying earlier, and kind of...
got to get off.
I've got to get off. I've got to get on with my job.
And they made their way up here. And, you know, you can lead yourself into something of a false sense of security because you don't see anything as you're coming up the hill. You come up here and, you can see a long way, but we've got bushes and we've got ridges and there are some ditches. Ideal places for an ambush, which is what happened pretty much where we are.
Wow.
The French were suddenly attacked by a small group of the Isle of Wight militia who were able to gather around and suddenly push the French soldiers that had wandered their way up here down towards the boats and away. The French, the French admiral, having seen what was going on, then made an order to send further reinforcements ashore at that point, which they did. And given that we've only got a small number of Isle of Wight militia here and a particularly small band up on top of the hill here, they got chased back up to the top of the hill and further over down towards the other side of the end of the hill here, where there's a bridge that goes across the marshy ground between the eastern end of the island and the main part of the island. And at the time, that was the only crossing. So they had to come across this bridge, and the Isle of Wight militia made their way back across the bridge and then cut the last arch on the bridge. They demolished it.
Oh, did they?
So that it would be more difficult for the French to cross. And they had a wall there and placed 2 guns behind the wall facing directly along this long bridge so that the French couldn't easily chase them across and make it over into the main part of the island.
Right.
I think in a lot of ways that was the crucial moment in the land battle at which Henry's kingdom was saved.
Do you really?
Because the French had no opportunity to rush across and expand out into the rest of the island. So the French really got stopped at the point of that of the bridge. The French had discussions on board the flagship and decided that one of the things they could do would be to actually capture the whole of the Isle of Wight. They had some detailed discussions about this, and they were certainly thinking through some plans because some of the French command were talking about building fortifications in order to hold the Isle of Wight, because if they could hold the island, they would control the Solent.
Yes, and you've got a base, haven't you, potentially, to much more convenient base to launch an attack on England, on the rest of England.
Yep, it would be a place you could muster up a big army and then make a short crossing over the Solent.
That would have been much more dangerous scenario.
Oh, absolutely. Now, the problem with that, though, is that if you're going to put fortifications in, you need pioneers to build the fortifications. You need soldiers to protect the pioneers while they build the fortifications. They estimated it would take 6,000 pioneers and 6,000 soldiers. That's 12,000, which would be double the number of people who lived on the Isle of Wight generally. Now, the Isle of Wight would have been able to support itself from its own agriculture. To feed 6,000 people, it could not feed 18,000 people.
Yeah, right.
So the problem would be, how do you get supplies from France over to the Isle of Wight? And on the island, there are no ports on the south coast of the island, only on the north coast. So you have to come and sail your ships very close to the English shore, which would not work. And they thought about this in some detail and concluded that they couldn't ensure the supply of food or wine to the garrison on the Isle of Wight, and therefore they wouldn't proceed with it.
Once again, our geography comes to save the day, doesn't it, really?
It does, yes. You know, it was potentially such overwhelming odds that Henry was facing.
Yeah.
But somehow they muddled through.
Yeah.
And got away with it.
So how long were the French on the island before they decided actually there was really nothing to be gained by being here?
Probably only 2 or 3 days, and only on this eastern section of the island. They didn't manage to get through to the north coast. They didn't manage to land near Quor Abbey. They didn't manage to land anywhere further along because of the English fleet sitting out at Spithead. So there was, you know, potentially a lot of things going on. The other key element is probably the burning of the flagship back in Le Havre, because one thing that didn't happen was that Francois did not accompany his army or his fleet. And consequently, he'd left all the political and tactical decisions in the hands of his admiral, Claude Dannebot. And I get the impression anyway, that Claude Dannebot was quite a wise man. He certainly knew that both Henry and Francois were coming towards the end of their lives, and that neither of them were well men. And he thought that it probably wasn't worth pressing home the attacks here, because it would cost far too much in blood and treasure. And he took a very pragmatic decision, which is that the Mary Rose had been sunk, the Isle of Wight had been attacked, it had been burnt in parts around Bembridge. The English had sunk one of the French galleys just off St Helens in the eastern end of the Isle of Wight, and consequently it could be seen that honour had been done. It was a 1-1 draw on ships, and that really the most important thing for Francois was getting into a better position to negotiate peace for the return of Boulogne. So the fleet upped anchor and sailed off up the English Channel towards Boulogne. Didn't quite stop there, because some of the French ships stopped somewhere near Shoreham in Sussex and made some landings there, where they were repulsed rather bloodily by the Sussex militia. It was really a bit of a privateering operation.
It sounds like it, yes.
To take opportune moment.
Again, not officially sanctioned.
Not really, no. But the rest of the fleet and the stragglers after got off into the seas off Boulogne and started to harry the English ships supplying the English garrison at Boulogne. And it petered out over the winter. There was protracted negotiations going on. Henry had a team working in northern France, in Ardres, where they were negotiating potential peace terms. And that went on for quite some time.
So it almost sounds like there was a case of, well, they didn't really lose the battle, but it's kind of the big picture, lose the battle to win the war. There was a bigger picture at play, at least as far as the French admiral. Very wise.
I think so. I think it was definitely the right thing to do at that point, because ultimately the English gave the French Boulogne back. We also ceded Calais at the same time. The French never paid the agreed amounts of reparations, and so that was clear. The English returned to France the statue of the Virgin Mary that they had stolen from the Basilica at Boulogne, on which the Boulogne pilgrimage business was based. And at the end, everybody was moderately happy with the arrival of peace once again.
Excellent. Well, that's an absolutely fantastic story, and there are various facets of that I really hadn't considered, thought about. So that was really interesting. I think the other thing we will want to do is to talk in more detail about the battle itself, and particularly the sinking of the Mary Rose. But I'm just wondering whether we should do that from the other side of the Solent and go and stand.
That would be fantastic.
In the footsteps of Henry VIII and retell the dramatic story of the Mary Rose on the day that this podcast goes live, the anniversary of her sinking, through Henry's eyes. How does that sound, Dominic?
That sounds perfect. Henry would have had a very different view from the point where he was standing.
So I think what we're going to do is we're going to rendezvous again in a day or so's time on the Solent and go over to Southsea Castle, and we'll pick up the story with our dear listeners there.
Splendid.
Well, Dominic, as promised, we have rendezvoused barely 2 days later, but back on the mainland. So we are at Southsea, just near Portsmouth. How far have we come from where we were standing up on Bainbridge Down?
About 10 miles up to the north.
Okay.
And we're standing right where Henry VIII is shown in the Cowdray picture.
That's awesome, isn't it?
It is.
Amazing. It's very clearly showed, isn't it?
It is, yes. I mean, in those days there wasn't a fountain here, but Southsea Castle, absolutely. Right in the middle of the Cowdray picture. That's exactly the spot where Henry VIII watched the Mary Rose sink.
And that's why we're here, because when we were over on the Isle of Wight, of course, we were talking about the French and seeing things largely from a French perspective. But of course, the English had a very different, literally, geographic perspective, as well as, I guess, a different sort of cultural perspective on it. So maybe we can use our time here to talk a little bit about why Southsea, why here? Was Henry actually here at the castle?
Very much so, and he'd timed his arrival here to perfection, having made his way down from Greenwich, the palace at Greenwich, via various stops en route to arrive here about 10 days later on the 15th of August 1545. Just 3 days before the French fleet turns up off the Isle of Wight.
How did he know to time it so well? Communication is something that really interests me.
It's astonishing how many letters were coming in and out from Henry's court, and he was operating the Privy Council here in Portsmouth. They had a meeting on the 15th of July, and therefore they were here ready, and messages going out, messages coming in. I mean, one of the things that we do know is that he was able to keep in really good contact with people as far away as Antwerp, as he was sending letters off wanting to know what's happened to his German mercenary troops that he'd ordered and hadn't yet turned up. So lots of things going on, and the amount of information coming in was amazing. So if we think about it as well, that during the battle, Henry was here, his command group was here, and yet the forces were dispersed across a very large area, right over to the Isle of Wight where we were standing on top of the Downs, but also right across the rest of the Isle of Wight, and then right over to the west on the mainland side, and indeed right down into the West Country, down to Exeter and down to as far as Falmouth. So information, really important. So I can just imagine riders with dispatches going off in all directions.
And Henry had built a series of forts, hadn't he?
Yes, he had.
Quite recently.
That's right. Well, the device forts were forts built by Henry VIII's orders, using a good deal of the money from the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s through to the 1540s. And indeed, Southsea Castle was one of the last of the forts to be built. That was desperately being built in 1544, 1545. So absolutely brand new and ready for action, just about, at the arrival of the French fleet in July 1545.
Before I forget, because obviously the Tudor Travel Guide is all about going and visiting places, and clearly people who are watching this will see that one of those forts survives. Are there others that people can go and visit and see for themselves?
Yes, there are. I mean, some of the most lovely are over on the Kent coast. There's Dover Castle was already there. Deal Castle, absolutely lovely Henry VIII fort, and Walmer Castle, which has got wonderful more modern gardens as well as the fort itself. Really well worth a visit.
Okay, well that's a top tip.
Indeed, top tip. And if anyone wants to see one in ruins, I can highly recommend Camber Castle near Rye in East Sussex, which is just the ruins of one of Henry's forts, right in the middle of an open piece of coastal landscape. Quite magical.
And I think, you know, we were mentioning before we began recording here what an incredible condition some of the forts are still in 500 years on. And you were mentioning this was in use until, well, not that long ago.
Well, about 1960. It was still in military use. Yeah, so it is amazing that something built in a hurry for a national emergency in 1544-45 was still being used well into the 20th century.
Now, going back to the Privy Council meeting, because that was staying with me, do we know what was discussed at that council meeting? Because I'm still reeling from the fact of how it was all coordinated and how Henry happened to arrive at such a convenient position. You know, they must have known that the French forces were going to...
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess the intelligence that they were receiving from their spies in France must have been pretty current and pretty accurate. But when you think about it, it's rather difficult to hide a big invasion fleet in France and the amassing of a large number of soldiers in Le Havre. People would have noticed, you know, a big influx of heavily armed soldiers into an area always attracts attention.
Is there any chance, though, that they might have decided to anchor like off the Kent coast, for example?
Well, I suppose they could have done, but, you know, again, that might be more difficult. There aren't easy places where they could land lots of troops.
And of course, you were talking about the Isle of Wight potentially being part of the grand plan.
It could have been.
Yeah.
We honestly don't know the exact nature of what they were thinking about. We can surmise from their actions and from some of the reported discussions. But you know, it's quite a complicated business, and one would have thought that the French may well have wanted to have given it a bit more thought than they actually did.
Yeah, absolutely. So you referred quite rightly that the Cowdray mural clearly shows Henry literally riding over to enter Southsea Castle. What else can we see that's going on around Henry? Who's with him that day?
That's a very, very important question. Riding immediately behind Henry on a very fine grey horse is Sir Anthony Browne. Sir Anthony Browne was the master of the King's Horse and the man for whom the original Cowdray picture was painted. I like to think of Sir Anthony as being what we might term a railway modeller these days. Somebody who really wanted to get the representation exactly right. And it was very much a painting that would show Sir Anthony's deeds with the king at the moment that they saved the Kingdom of England. So it's for us to look at the picture, it's for us to understand it and to remember Sir Anthony Browne. And, you know, he succeeded in getting us to talk about him nearly 500 years on.
He so did. It's such a good point. And I should point out to our dear listeners that we, of course, recorded a whole podcast episode talking specifically about the Cowdray murals at Cowdray House. So I will put a link in the description associated with this podcast if you want to go back and listen to that utterly fascinating dissection of the Cowdray murals, because there's so much to see. The detail is phenomenal, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, and we're standing in the middle of that picture.
Wow.
You know, and we can see today all the things that were there, the theatre within which that battle took place at Spithead in the Solent. And just over to the south of us is where the English fleet had amassed, and then about 10 to 15 miles further over to the south and to the east was the mass of that French fleet. You know, you just imagine that coming up over the horizon, 225 ships or so that you know are full of troops wanting to invade your country, and you're standing here in Southsea looking over the sea thinking, my goodness, they're coming this way. And then you look up to the west from here and you see the English fleet sitting there at anchor at Spithead in the middle of the Solent. And you think, well, are those going to be our saviours? Yeah. Who knows at that point?
Tense moment right there.
Very tense moments.
I can imagine a few choice words might have been said, but
I'm sure they were.
I'd love to get into Henry's head at that very moment. Well, good. We've arrived at the day of the battle, and I think we should talk about it, because as we stand here on Southsea Castle overlooking the Solent, we can see all the main geographic points. So could you talk us through what happened that day and maybe point out some of the important things and places that we can look out for?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, if we look directly south from Southsea Castle out into the middle of the Solent, we can see a marker buoy, just a little point on the top of it, which is where the Mary Rose sank. And you can see she's not very far offshore, perhaps about a mile south of Southsea Castle, and most importantly, only about 600 yards south of a sandbank that's underneath the surface of the sea. Because if she'd carried on sailing in the direction she was when she capsized, for just another few minutes, she would have run aground just over there.
And therefore not sunk, and therefore so many lives saved.
Absolutely, a good 500 men would have been saved. And we wouldn't have had the Mary Rose to excavate and raise from the seabed. We wouldn't have had all of that wonderful Tudor archaeology, and perhaps we wouldn't be telling their story today.
Yeah.
And I think it's important also that we remember those men on board the Mary Rose who were doing their absolute utmost to serve their king and country, defending it from invasion by the French.
Yeah.
It was a serious invasion attempt.
Yes, it sounds like it.
And, you know, all of the ships and the soldiers that Henry had here at Portsmouth were working together along with all of his shoreline fortifications, the device forts, to provide a bulwark against that invasion. And although nobody had really ever put all of this together before and tried to work it as a system. Somehow or other, Henry and his Tudor commanders managed to make it work well enough in order to deter the invasion and stop it from actually happening. Only the landings on the Isle of Wight, no major landings on this part of the mainland shore, just the opportunistic attack as the French were making their way back up the English Channel after the real confrontation here at Portsmouth.
Oh, that morning, why that morning? The French had been anchored over there for 2 or 3 days. What changed?
They hadn't at that stage. The immediate naval engagement happened around about the evening that they arrived. They started shooting some guns. That then went quiet overnight. The following morning is when, the 19th of July, the Sunday, is when they sent the first party of attack galleys in to start firing at the bows of the leading ships in the English fleet, who couldn't move because there was no wind.
Yeah, absolutely. And that changed?
Over the day it did change because the sea breeze blows up in the afternoon, as it always does in the Solent. So you know you're going to get a southwesterly breeze around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Right. And that's exactly what they picked up. That's why the Mary Rose was able to make her last fateful journey across the Solent, heading northwards so that she could bring her starboard side guns to bear on the attacking French galleys. And you know, it seems not unreasonable that they would want to do that if they'd been taking incoming fire for all of the morning and some of the afternoon. You know, they want to get their own back a bit, or at least be seen to do so. And, you know, knowing that Henry was here at Southsea Castle and that Henry the King himself was watching their every move with, you know, his eagle eyes, and no doubt being appropriately approving or critical of what happened, they would have really wanted to please their king. You know, we don't know the exact nature of the exchanges that were happening here with Henry, but you know, we can think about it and we can certainly imagine these things.
And because I'm thinking about, once the battle is underway, what's the communication like between Henry here and his captain of the fleet, or the admiral of the fleet? It
would have been quite difficult. Certainly it wouldn't be possible to provide immediate communication that would say, do this now. All of this would have had to have been discussed and planned beforehand.
Right.
And to a certain degree, Henry would have had to have left the naval matters, the ship matters, to John Dudley, Lord Lisle, as the admiral. And he was experienced and would be able to make sensible decisions in the circumstances as they unfolded. So you have a lot of things going on, some of which can be controlled and most of which can't directly. So it's really interesting to think about the complexities of all of that.
And we should probably just talk a little bit, I know we've covered this before when we talked in the podcast, but briefly we should say how we think the Mary Rose sank and why she sank.
Well, what we know about the Mary Rose is that she had been sailing as a good and reliable ship for 34 years before she suddenly sank on a summer's afternoon in calm coastal waters just off Portsmouth. Now, something has to have gone wrong. She was a good ship, she was an experienced ship, she had an experienced crew. It's certainly my view that she'd been hit by French gunfire probably hours before she sank.
Right.
A long time. So that in that time, having been hit and having shipped some water into her hold, that the ship then became what we would call tender. She'd be sitting low in the water, and rolling slowly, and probably further than she would normally do in normally buoyant circumstances.
I see.
Such that she'd roll over just a bit too far and hold just a bit too long. And as you're going lower in the water, so the gun ports and the sills of the gun ports get closer and closer to the surface of the sea, and then all of a sudden they dip below.
So can I just interrupt you there? Surely people on board noticed that happening?
Oh yes, I'm sure they knew.
How are you sure that they knew?
Well, the likelihood is that they had been laying out anchors and anchor cables on the upper deck of the ship in order to be able to pay them out quickly on a run-in to run aground. I think the crew and the sailing master were in the process of trying to save the ship by running her aground on Spitbank. If she'd got slightly too full of water, if she'd rolled just a bit too far and was still making forward progress through the water at that point, then any dip of the gun ports below the surface of the sea would instantly or almost instantly fill the upper gun deck with water. So you'd have much more weight high up in the ship, which would just tug it over. There's another possibility, which is that they might have been unlucky enough to run over their own anchor cable. Now this is one theory that is relatively new to the discussions. We don't have full evidence to back anything up, so it's just part of the discussions, part of the thinking. But it's a possibility that if the anchor had been thrown over and then the ship drifted just a bit too far across the top of the cable, that would go underneath the ship and then pull it over.
I see,
or at least start to do so.
Yeah, right.
You know, and normal action in those cases is to axe through the anchor cable as quickly as you possibly can. Maybe they had time, maybe they didn't. What we would need to find is where that anchor is out in the Solent.
I see.
Now, it may be there, it may not be there, but it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So it wouldn't be an easy thing to find, but you know, who knows?
Because it took decades, centuries to actually find the wreck of the Mary Rose, didn't it?
Well, that's right. She was found on two occasions, really. One when the Dean brothers were diving on her in the 1830s, and then again when Alexander McKee rediscovered the wreck site by sonar in the late 1960s and by actual digging in 1971. And from there were small excavations made, and then leading up to the formation of the Mary Rose Trust in 1979, who then undertook 3 years of incredibly painstaking, careful excavation of the site, resulting in the final raising of the hull from the seabed in 1982. Quite a moment.
Quite a moment. So the Mary Rose is going down. We know the story of her sinking and sadly the huge loss of life on board it. And then we've got Henry standing here, reportedly with the wife of...
reportedly with the wife of the Vice Admiral, Sir George Carew. And it's certainly thought that he wasn't exactly comforting to Lady Carew.
Go on, tell me, what did he say? What did El Hennes say?
I can't possibly go there at this point. But yes, it seems a little callous.
Insensitive.
Insensitive, yes. But then Henry's mind would have been on other matters. He was still facing a huge invasion threat. Yes, he'd lost one ship, but that's one ship amongst many. There are other ships.
Had a war.
There is a war to be fought. There is a peace to be negotiated. And, you know, let's face it, every war always ends in a political peace negotiation. Now, Henry will have known that as much as anybody else, and he would have been looking for where his advantage would be at that point of negotiating the peace.
And he's no fool, is he? As far as he's no fool. From an English perspective, then, when was the danger past? do you think?
Probably after the French had made their various landings on the Isle of Wight and had decided that there really wasn't any point in pressing home a full frontal attack on Portsmouth or the Solent area. At the point where the French decided to head off back up the channel to lay siege to the town of Boleyn that Henry had captured from them the year before, at that moment, probably the worst of the military threat subsided, and everybody breathed a huge sigh of relief. I mean, it's certainly true that when Henry himself left Portsmouth...
Which was when, by the way? How long was he here for?
He was here for a few days. I forget the exact date he left, but he wrote a letter from the top of Portsdown Hill, looking back down to the fleet, which reprimands the Admiral for not having lined the ships up the way Henry wanted them.
Oh, did he really?
Yes.
He's always got to have the last word, hasn't he?
I think so. I think it was important.
I think it was just important in so many ways. Oh my goodness. You know, I've got a question for you. I don't know whether you can answer this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Was this Battle of the Solent the first serious invasion attempt since the Norman invasion of England?
To be honest, of any size and complexity where it had been put together, yes. It was a really big moment in English history because it was such a concerted effort that somehow didn't quite carry through, but it could have done.
Could have done. And so I have a part B to the question. I'm thinking about the Spanish Armada. Where do they compare in terms of the threat to England and almost the success of the campaign?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question because the English were clearly making preparations in Elizabeth's reign in order to see off the threat from Spain. And Lord Burleigh had a manuscript map made of the Solent and the Isle of Wight, showing all of the fortifications around the island and the mainland. Many of them were Henry's fortifications. And he was clearly thinking about how those could be used to protect the kingdom should the same kind of action actually happen. The other thing is that the English fleet, when it opposed the Spanish fleet, didn't wait for the Spanish to arrive here at Portsmouth or out in the Solent. They sailed from Plymouth in order to break up the Spanish fleet at sea long before it arrived en masse. And if you think about it, it's really only just over 40 years later. So there would have been folk memory or family memory of some of those people who had been at the battle in 1545, who were then facing a very similar threat in 1588. So it seems not unreasonable that the English would have learnt from their earlier experiences and perhaps enhanced what they did, tweaked their methods in order to break up the threat before it actually arrives.
Yeah, interesting. Very, very interesting. Maybe the Spanish Armada is a topic for another day. It's not not something I've discussed before, but maybe you'll come back and talk to us on another podcast about it.
Well, perhaps that would be lovely.
Well, I think the battle is drawing to a close, so maybe our conversation is drawing to a close. It's been wonderful, I have to say. Thank you so much for persuading me to come over to the Isle of Wight.
Well, thank you for coming, Sarah.
And seeing the battle from a different perspective, I've learnt yet more, which I thought I've done quite a bit of reading about the Mary Rose now and the battle, but yet again, Dominic, you have taken me to places I didn't know existed, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your experience.
Absolutely delighted.
Oh, well, thank you so much. But before we go, maybe we could just round up by by me asking you, where can people see more or learn more about the Mary Rose, or indeed you and what you do outside of talking to me in this podcast?
Absolutely. Well, obviously the Mary Rose Museum, which is a truly world-class museum.
I agree.
Something that any student of Tudor history really must go and visit, because that collection of artefacts, the ordinary things that belong to the ordinary sailors, they just don't exist anywhere else. You know, they're dated to an exact moment in time. You know, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday the 19th of July 1545. And that's just so unlike most museum collections.
Yeah.
And then there's the other things that I do. I'm a trustee of the Classic Boat Museum at Cowes on the Isle of Wight. And one of the things we've got there is a high-resolution, life-size version of the Cowdray image. You can't see that anywhere else.
No, fantastic.
And that is just wonderful when you can see all of the tiny details in that totally amazing picture.
Yes, you can spend such a long time studying that picture, can't you? It's just such a wealth of information.
Amazing.
Well, that's been amazing. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll meet again in another podcast, but I thank you sincerely for being our tour guide on this particular episode.
It's been a total pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.